I think it's interesting just to highlight some of the reasons why you get this from many perspectives. And so I just want to hop to something here. Everyone remembers and knows from the Paris Climate Accord, not that, of course, in DC, the Paris Climate Accord has the weight it does where we live, but just to remember that the goal from going from 4.5 or more degrees C of warming, the Paris Accord was to cut 1 degree or 1.5 degrees off if you also count the Kigali Accords, which that basically says that what the countries committed to, and China not only committed, but they were the country that committed, and then they promptly went out and invested over $300 billion in the energy efficiency, renewables, smart transportation sector. That, it's hard to sort of highlight how important that is. That still leaves us almost an equal part of things we have to do to get to the Paris Accords. So just to put context, not that Paris Accords mean much in here, but cheapest power plant I was saying before 2 years ago came in the world at around 3 cents a kilowatt hour in Dubai, solar. Most recent Saudi projects, ironically in Saudi Arabia and in Arizona in the United States, came in at 1.7 cents per kilowatt hour. There is no way any technology can beat that has any kind of a legacy complication of other technology. Doesn't mean we'll pick it, but just the prices have changed, I said this before, so dramatically that even really savvy people in the field don't always know. And this is the point that both speakers made in different ways, and I just wanted to put the numbers analytically. These curves are the so-called learning or experience curves. So this is not time, this is price in log scale versus total installed cumulative capacity, right? And curves have different slopes. This is ethanol, this is solar photovoltaics, solar thermal, wind power, and then pollution controls on power plants, all of which show this expected form. The learning curve shows between a 10 and a 20% drop in price every time you double the number of units deployed. And things that you mass produce, big pens, solar panels, calculators, condoms, whatever it might be that you mass produce in factories, show this curve. We've seen it since the 30s. This is, very, very robust. Nuclear power is the one that shows a forgetting curve. Now, this is the data. There is no argument that's the price trend. When I sit down and argue with a Burt Richter, for those of you who know, Nobel Prize winner at Stanford, very pro-nuclear, he doesn't dispute the numbers, but he says it's ridiculously unfair to talk about what the costs of a future technology will be. It's going to have all these great new features. Those of you who are experts on Generation 4, you know what those parameters are. Cheaper than plants, safer than plants, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not disputing what a future technology might provide. I'm just saying that we have now almost 100 years of data on different technologies and nuclear and battleships. And there's another energy technology which also so far shows this curve. And that is one of the big differences, aside from born secret, born not secret, et cetera, is that mass-produced technologies and those that are not mass-produced have a big difference. CCS is a technology, no matter how good you think the separation is not likely to follow this learning curve.
Could you tell us what CCS stands
Carbon
for?
capture and storage.
Thank you.
Now, there's lots of huge carbon capture and storage advocates out there. I don't disagree, and we heard a mention of it before. But the reason why CCS, unless it totally breaks every single law of economics and technology, which this is kind of one summary of, is not likely to go there, is because no matter how good the separation at the gas or coal plant is, and separating carbon out of gas stream is incredibly hard because the gas stream is so large. Ironically, coal is a better fit for CCS than gas is, by about a factor of 1,000, because that's the volume difference in the effluent gases. But the hard part of CCS is not doing this at the plant. We know how to do this. There's processes, ironically, going back to German efforts during World War II. But the issue is putting it underground, keeping it there safely. And that doesn't scale with manufacturing. That's a function of the geology, and we have lots of data on preserving wells, capping wells, etc., and it doesn't show this learning curve. So if you want to bet on sectors, this is a pretty clear message that those things that you can mass produce and bring material science and better economics to bear, that's a pretty interesting part of the story. So I won't go through the details. My lab studies the power systems in lots of parts of the world. The ones in green are power system models we built in conjunction with universities and governments. And yes, the hardest one we built was with China, largely because of NDRC and State Grid. But it's interesting, all the rest of them, all the models look very, very similar. I won't go through them. These are power sector expansion models with super detailed models of each transmission line, each policy. Forget all that. Big solar plants in the deserts of California, forget all that. In the work we've done in China, there's three cases. One is the kind of the growth, the projected growth curve, and you saw in particular then David's graph showing the lower growth rates. And then there's what China proposed to do in Paris, which is to peak emissions by 2030. Didn't say what level. It kind of pissed off many people because they said peak, but they didn't say peak 2% above current levels or 1,000%. Turns out almost every forecast is that China will peak its emissions probably within 25% of where they are now at most. And they will do it ahead of schedule, which is unheard of. Before 2030, China is now forecast by almost everyone to peak their emissions. So without doing any of the details of what's going to go on, one projection from all the models from our model, that from the Energy Foundation, is that in China's energy future, a huge player is going to be Inner Mongolia. Because solar and wind and whatever CCS they do will almost certainly be here as well near Erdos. So I won't get into any of the details, all the power system models, just focus on the last picture, which hopefully the colors are reasonably explanatory. So black is coal. This is the run between you can't read it and you can't read it plus 50. That's today in 2050. I don't know what, anyway. But so black is coal. Here we have gas and combined heat and power. Here we have yellow is solar. Light blue is wind, hydro is here, and nuclear is red. This is the business as usual. This is with a carbon cap. This is being aggressive on technology like China is doing now. And this is meeting the 2050 IPCC target 80% cuts. And you can, which one you want to look at. China, in my view, is going to be somewhere between here and here. But depending where you want to look, what I want to highlight is that in all of these views, just like the two previous speakers said, nuclear is not a big deal. And it's such a small deal in nuclear's biggest market in the world that whether China preserves some of that or decides it's not worth it on the cost, employment, there's no export market, the export market is dried up. Not only was some of you may have followed the famous Finnish and French nuclear plant that was another plant just like Hinkley, priced out at $1.8 billion, and it will come in at least $11 billion. Now, that is not a good sign for the export, and you heard all of the softening features of the Chinese nuclear market. If nuclear can't make it in China, it can't make it anywhere. Period, full stop, no debate. You can argue politically we're going to keep it alive, but the world has 424 nuclear plants operating today. By 2030, there are 60 more plants either under construction or proposed. You heard in the previous talk, 25 of them are in China, and that market is softening. And so you can keep it alive, no question. But again, no one runs the world based on models, I think, thank goodness. But what this says is that if you do something dramatically different, you are violating what economics says at every step of the way. Not that it won't happen, but that kind of picture is the key reality. And it's basically, my long-winded version of saying what you just heard in the previous two speakers. The last thing I want to put up, though, for discussion is this, and this gets directly into the complex politics. This is China's plan. Railway is in pink. Electricity is in yellow. Gas lines are in gray. But I just want to highlight the picture. This is China's plan that's stage one of One Belt, One Road. And what China is doing right now is testing out the economics and the politics of massively globally interconnecting the world by their push into Southeast Asia. And huge dams are being built on the Mekong, on the Irrawaddy, and elsewhere to send power to China. It's being sold as regional interconnection, opening up markets. It's being sold in all of the kind of the positive ways. But it's basically a huge sucking sound of electrons going this way.
For what it's worth, Grenatech has another chart, and so does Bloom Energy.
Right.
You might even see competition from the Japanese and Koreans.
Right. They just
try
don't
to
right.
mix things up so that this is not totally dominated by the
Totally
Chinese.
true. And just like we heard before, they just don't. They don't have the capital to compete, but they may well do it. And I just want to highlight the Taiwan piece of the story. Not that that's the politically attractive one, but China is physically building this network. I am right now dealing directly with power plants and transmission lines being built in this region here. The Taiwan piece is coming. Whether it ends up being politically connected or not, we'll see. But in terms of thinking about opportunities and options, doesn't mean that slowing in China and huge economic problems that might come to you might change dramatically. But I'm just trying to contrast what is being built, what is economic today, with lots of bads. There's a huge economic down story, environmental down story. But in terms of talking about the really weak economics of nuclear in the country where nuclear's economics are the best, relative to pictures that would build out a different story. And so it says something for China. It also says something for Taiwan. As I mentioned before, Taiwan has incredibly good offshore wind. You never base the whole future on one technology, but it's attractive. It's not driven by the kind of the massive 100-foot swells that we get off the California coast, where we're already building. All the Scandinavian companies are setting up deals. They're already building off Delaware. There's all these kinds of efforts. Same thing could happen here. China, as you all know, is building massive amounts of solar and wind out in the east. And so getting back to the maps for a second, this is not the theory, this is the investment map of State Grid. State Grid in China is a $135 billion a year company. And it is essentially a company that is FERC combined with an engineering firm. So they ask themselves, after they plot a project, what it will cost, and they do it. This is the transmission build map to bring all of that energy, renewable energy largely, from the west to the east. And China's 90 gigawatts of installed wind, only about 65 gigawatts of that is actually connected to the grid yet. So talk with 30 gigawatts of installed wind machines that will ultimately be connected. And China gets all this criticism, oh, you built all this wind, you couldn't connect it. That's the wrong read. China built wind really fast. Mass producing wind turbines bring global prices down. And as they do that, they're learning more about transmission. Chongqing is the global leading laboratory for high voltage DC transmission. And they built the wind first, and now they're going to connect it. And if the high voltage DC lines are reliable enough, they will go that way. Otherwise, they'll go high voltage AC. But most people think they'll do the DC. So just to kind of highlight where the hardware and the decisions are, China, in my view, will meet this target I highlighted here at least. This is beating the 2030 Paris goals. Whether it gets all the way to the 2050 goal, I think they will, but there's reason to be skeptical. But these, again, don't show much nuclear in here, and they certainly highlight much more of this renewable path. And so if you think about these two, I know I've gone over, I will stop.